So would you like to start by introducing yourself and how you came to being involved with Chisenhale Dance Space?
Yes, I was a teacher, and in the mid-80s, things were getting a bit troublesome in education, so I wanted to move on. I had a very great friend, still do have a very great friend, Pushkala Gopal, who at the time was the director of the Akademi of Indian Dance. And she rang me up the day after I'd stopped teaching and said, I'm in a bit of a fix. I need somebody to come into the office because the person who normally does the job is not very well. So I knew nothing about any of it at all. So I turned up at the place and I started being the administrator of the Akademi of Indian Dance. And Dick Matchett was working there as well. So he was the next bit. And Dean Wybrow, who was the press officer at the place, was the person who really introduced me to dance, because I don't know whether it was the first season of Spring Loaded. It was 86 or 87 anyway, but he used to give me free tickets because there was never anybody there. And I actually got totally hooked on the performances there, starting with My Sex, Our Dance by Deviate. And I'd never seen anything like it. Anyway, I didn't want to stay at the Akademi of Indian Dance because I thought that it should be in the hands of an Indian dance specialist. So I applied for the job at Chisenhale, and that was it. So I had no background in dance, apart from my having seen loads of Indian classical dance. And I didn't get attracted to Chisenhale. I got attracted to somewhere where I could earn some money, basically.
And what was the role that you applied for at Chisenhale?
I think it was called coordinator, but I can't remember, coordinator or administrator. Yeah. And yeah, they were appointing another full-time post. Yeah. And that's what I applied for.
So that was 1987. And so what did you do within that role?
I think because I didn't know anything about dance, I had to be very careful. And I knew anyway that after no time at all, that it was really important to be a facilitator rather more than an intervener in the normal sense of the word. So I facilitated what the collective wanted to do. And that meant bringing quite a lot of the skills that I had already in terms of management and organisation, and tried to make sure that they were serving the needs of the dance rather more than anything else. So I never had any pretensions to be a collective member in the sense that I wasn't making artistic decisions. I was picking up on what the dance artists wanted to do and then making sure that as far as possible that could happen. I think it was very important not to have a structure which couldn't be adapted as things occurred, you know. It wasn't any good saying this is always going to happen on Monday or this is always going to happen in the following way or whatever. The important thing was that Chisenhale was partly about freeing the artists from all those very demanding and often frustrating structures.
Yeah. How did working at Chisenhale compare with other experiences that you'd had, you know, working within organisations? It was a collective member-led organisation, but what was that like to be part of?
Very hard work. I think perennially understanding that dance artists were leading and that they could actually access certain things which nobody had tried to access before. And so their very small space became very big in terms of what it stood for.
Yeah, brilliant.
I think most dancers didn't really feel confident enough to acknowledge the fact that they had an entitlement to a working space and to having their strengths as dance artists, which included thinking, acknowledged by the system. Nobody was acknowledging what dance and dancers had to give. And no, in my view, with obviously some exceptions, nobody was listening, because that was an extremely inconvenient place to start from.
And so how long were you at Chisenhale for?
5 years.
And, you know, did it change much over that period for you?
I think it always maintained its artist-led profile, and it also was very conscious of where it had come from. And sometimes I think that gets hidden, you know, when people are moving forward. In terms of its relationship with funders, I think that the funders that I dealt with were, for the majority, were very pleased that there was somebody doing what I was doing, and they always told me that. But it also posed a threat, not what I was doing, but the way that Chisenhale was, posed a threat to the status quo in dance. And of course, I knew nothing about the status quo in dance when I went there, but it's so glaringly obvious once you've been alerted to it. And I think it's really important that I think it was seen as a threat because it required a lot of people to change their attitudes, which of course they haven't, because the dance establishment remains the dance establishment. And I just found that there was always this assumption that there was something going on which probably wasn't going to help dance as we knew it, you know. And obviously the major thing is the relationship between dance artists and the environment in which they're functioning, because it's built on hierarchies and it's built on principles which the collective quite simply didn't buy into. And they needed somewhere where they could promote something different, which was what Chisenhale was. And of course, the people who came from the powers that be didn't come very often.
And at the time when you were there, were you getting a lot of proposals from artists wanting to put on something at Chisenhale, or was it much more people were invited in to contribute to the programme in some way?
No, because everybody knew that you could write and apply to perform at some particular, usually cha-cha-chas or something like that. So that was a regular programming operation. But on the whole, it was driven by people coming to Chisenhale to see whether they could do something. And I think the other thing is that there were a lot more venues than there are now, but they weren't purely dance venues. They were mixed performance venues, you know. I mean, places like Jackson's Lane and all those sorts of places, you know, they provided space. But I don't know, because I was never an insider for any of them, whether they really were working on the same principles. Yeah. And that's because they weren't artist-led in the same way, I think.
And how would you describe what Chisenhale was at that period of time?
Well, it was unique, you know, because of, I mean, it was still at a point in its development where being unique was really easy, in the sense that nobody else had dared to do quite what they were doing, you know. So that was the first thing. I think the collective was really hardworking, and you wouldn't have known that necessarily because they weren't automatically visible or present for most of the time, but they worked very, very hard and were committed to a whole series of things. In terms of the relationship with the local community, I've always had, I don't see why an organisation has to have a special relationship with their local community, particularly as that tends to change according to the funder's whims. But they did do things which pleased local people. But the real crux of the matter was, how could they carry on being themselves? And of course, in those days, it wasn't so difficult because you could technically finance yourself by all sorts of sort of small scale things that you might do. Whereas now, you know, if you're not employed in the traditional sense of the word, it's very hard to know how to survive as an artist. Mm. So I think Chisenhale was able to take all those things into account. In terms of what else it was, I don't know. I mean, it didn't have a very strongly developed public profile, but the overpowering sense of, here is a group of artists who have actually taken matters into their own hands. They haven't just talked about it or suffered or anything like that for no reason at all. They knew where they were going. And sometimes it's incredibly difficult because, you know, do you want to become more acceptable? And I think that was a big question, you know, like we started getting money like for the retractable seating, for instance. And I always felt, yes, that's really important, but there are dangers attached to it, you know? And I think that for me, the thing that saved the retractable seating was I could always say yes, but it has rebalanced the relationship between the performers and the audience, because the floor in Chisenhale covers a lot more space than the seating, which is the complete opposite of most venues, you know? And perhaps nobody realized that, including me at the time, because, I don't know, they took it for granted, you know? But I always felt that there were dangers, and I'm sure the others did as well. And I remember at the same time as the retractable seating, there was a discussion that went on for probably days about what colour the flooring should be, you know? And that sounds really bizarre now, but it's like we are going to make these decisions, you know? And things like, should we run a particular type of class which wasn't necessarily related to the roots of Chisenhale through X6? And it could take you over, you know. You could program, this sounds heretical, but you could program masses of community work, whatever that is, and you could program all sorts of things which might sound as if they would attract the funders or attract an audience or something. But the problem is that you start reaching points of, is this a compromise worth making, you know? Because it takes a lot of time and it detracts from what you're trying to do as independent artists.
Yeah, receiving recognition and understanding and support, whilst trying to still do what you want to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's before you've even started trying to explain to them what you want to do, you know. I mean, some of the most basic things, I think, are so entrenched in dance that, you know, they will carry on. But you don't want to get sucked into those practices or those artistic values or the power structure. You want to retain something different, because without places like Chisenhale, without artists who are pushing the boundaries, nothing new is ever going to emerge.
Yeah, the artists are really at the core of that, aren't they? Driving it all. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with me.